The Hong Kong Museum of Coastal Defense was converted to the museum from Lei Yue Mun Fort, a strategic location for battles in Hong Kong in the past, with one of them being World War II. Our visit to this museum sparked our interest in the Japanese occupation of Hong Kong, as well as how it ended. Before the Japanese occupation, Hong Kong was part of the British colony, thus it was not under direct attack during Japan's full-scale invasion of China. However, Hong Kong was impacted by the large number of refugees from China. The Japanese only began invading Hong Kong on December 8, 1941. This was known as the Battle of Hong Kong, and even though the British, Canadian, and Indian forces came together to resist the Japanese, their efforts were futile, as the British ended up surrendering to Japan after 18 days of fighting. December 25, 1941 was the start of the Japanese occupation, often referred to as the Dark Ages of Hong Kong. During the occupation, progress and development was reversed, and Japanese policies that were largely centered around Japanese troops caused a variety of social, political, and economical changes. However, a series of events caused Japan to abruptly surrender a few years into the occupation. The beginning of the end started with when the Potsdam Declaration was issued by the Allies, which basically requested all Japanese forces to unconditionally surrender, or face a total destruction of its forces and country, described as inevitable. Naturally, the Japanese ignored this request, causing the US to drop the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima on August 6th. The losses that resulted caused part of the Supreme War Council to express a desire for surrender, but the most opted to persist, leading to a second bomb being dropped on Nagasaki on August 9th. On the same day, Soviet Russia began invading Japan. They had already been planning to violate the Russo-Japanese Non-Aggression Pact for a solid period of time. The first act against Japan was when they ignored Japan's request for Russia to represent the former at Potsdam when the declaration was being created. There was no way Japan could withstand both attacks at the same time. Therefore, shortly before midnight on that day, they proposed surrender under the condition their emperor would remain their ruler. On August 12th, the US consented, stating Japan was to accept the US Supreme Commander as its authoritative figure, but the Emperor Hirohito would stay as their symbolic head of state. Japan's formal surrender occurred on August 15, 1945, with the formal signing beginning shortly after 9 a.m. at Tokyo Bay. The surrender meant that the Japanese would abide by the terms of the Potsdam Declaration, which mainly included the agreement to end all conflict and freeing of its prisoners of war and the withdrawal of its forces from all colonies. Immediately after hearing news of the surrender, Franklin Gimson, who had been Hong Kong's colonial secretary before he became a prisoner of war, immediately proclaimed himself to be the territory's acting governor and set up a temporary government.
There had been some political debate over who Hong Kong would belong to after the Japanese occupation. Franklin Roosevelt had proposed prior to the surrender that Britain should return Hong Kong to China, which had been a nationalist government led by Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang Kai-shek too wanted Hong Kong back, but after having been regarded as a superior figure after the war, he didn't want to fight a battle with Britain and lose. Therefore, he allowed Britain to take over under certain conditions. The handover of Hong Kong had to take place after he accepted the surrender for China, and there had to be one Chinese and one American general present at the handover. The handover of Hong Kong took place on August 30th between the Japanese Army and Royal Navy. There had been no Allied naval forces near Hong Kong at the time of the surrender, therefore Sir Cecil Harcourt, the British Rear Admiral, located in Australia at the time of the surrender, was dispatched along with 19 ships making up a Royal Navy squadron and only arrived on the day of the handover. However, the documents accepting the surrender were only signed on September 16th. After Britain regained control over Hong Kong, Japanese forces were taken as prisoners of war. They were put to work as gendarmerie, hospital orderlies, and laborers, but the British ensured that they stayed clear of Chinese labor, so Britain could not be accused of giving them job opportunities over native workers. After the occupation, Mark Young was reinstated as governor, with a team of professional administrators sent to implement his policies. These administrators aimed to set policies that would allow everyone in Hong Kong's prosperity, and as they were financially uninterested in the city, the policies they set were considered more objective. Extremely influential business people were assigned to roles in the executive and legislative councils, and while these people were initially solely British, successful Chinese were later accepted. As a result, this group of leaders worked towards building for Hong Kong a favorable atmosphere for doing business. The British also put in place some actions in 1946, which were called the 1946 Outlook. They became less colonial and tried to make Hong Kong people feel more like they belonged in the city by moving Chinese people into positions of higher rank.
After Hong Kong was handed back to the British, there were minor changes such as the main language, as Japanese had forced Japanese language courses to be taught at schools, and the name of roads, which were changed to Japanese names under the occupation and then changed back to English names after it ended. However, one of the main changes was the population size, which dropped from 1.6 million to 600,000 during the occupation. After the Japanese surrendered, the population started increasing again as locals and Chinese refugees fled to Hong Kong. Another change that occurred after the Japanese occupation ended was the attitude towards foreigners. Japan aimed to form the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. Therefore, non-Asians in Hong Kong during the Japanese occupation became prisoners of war or had low status. However, once Britain regained power of Hong Kong, prejudice against Europeans ended, and foreigners were once again respected. The social and political changes after the occupation spurred a series of economic changes. The Japanese occupation had halted and reversed Hong Kong's economic progress, causing food shortages and high inflation. Thus, Hong Kong took years to re-establish and stabilize its economy. When the population started to increase again after the Japanese surrender, the refugees from the Chinese Civil War that came to Hong Kong provided cheap labor, allowing the textile industry to boom. The economic growth rate averaged around 10% a year by the 1950s, due to not only the increase in production, but also foreign investment and liberal tax policies. Hong Kong dollars were also reintroduced after being banned and replaced by Japanese yen under the Japanese rule. This series of positive changes helped Hong Kong rebuild itself for the years following the occupation. Under the Japanese rule, Hong Kong's undoing in terms of economy and politics was due to the Japanese policies that were centered around their troops. They largely abused their power through violence and discrimination, and thus in the end, this not only led to Hong Kong citizens rebelling, but also their own downfall, showing that relationships of power, when abused, can negatively impact people and cause conflict.